Welcome back. Today we meet another legend, another descent, another man who blurred the line between victim and villain. Have you ever convinced yourself you're doing the right thing, even when, deep down, you knew you weren't? Meet Walter White, teacher, father, husband, and eventually something much darker. What happens inside a person when survival turns into ambition and ambition slowly twists into power? Walter White was, by all appearances, painfully ordinary. A mild-mannered high school chemistry teacher, living in quiet desperation, teaching bored students by day and scrubbing hubcaps at a car wash by night. Walter wasn't happy. He'd grown numb to dreams he'd long abandoned, but he was stable, predictable, and harmless. Everything changed in an instant. When Walter received his terminal cancer diagnosis, it wasn't just a death sentence. It was a brutal mirror held up to his entire existence. Psychologically, a diagnosis like this often acts as a catalyst, tearing through denial and routine, forcing a person to face the question they've avoided their entire life. What have I actually done with my time? In that moment, Walter wasn't crying. He wasn't yelling. He was staring at a tiny yellow mustard stain on the doctor's white coat. That one detail, so mundane, so meaningless, captured his attention. Why? Because in moments of emotional shock, the mind often fixates on something small and concrete to avoid collapsing under the weight of the real threat. That mustard stain was Walter's way of keeping himself from falling apart, a desperate anchor in a world that had just slipped out from under him. The diagnosis didn't just threaten his life, it shook his identity, and in its aftermath, Walter didn't rage or break down. He calculated. Quietly, cautiously, he started asking himself how to protect the people he loved from the chaos he was about to leave behind. It wasn't ambition, not yet. It was fear, love, and desperation, twisted into resolve. A man with nothing left, grasping for the one thing he still understood: control through logic, purpose through action. Walter told himself one story, again and again. I'm doing this for my family. It was his shield, his mantra, his excuse. At first, it even felt true. The medical bills were overwhelming. His son had special needs. Skylar was pregnant, and Walter was staring down death with nothing to leave behind but a stack of unpaid bills and a legacy of quiet failure. So when the opportunity came to cook meth using his expertise in chemistry, it didn't feel like a crime. It felt like redemption, a secret sacrifice, something noble. But here's the thing about self-deception. The more often we say something, the more we believe it, even when our actions tell another story. In psychology, this is called rationalization, when we justify choices that go against our morals by attaching them to a greater purpose. Walter didn't want to think of himself as a criminal, so he became a martyr instead. But even in those early days, there were cracks in the mask. He didn't just cook once. He didn't stop once he had enough to cover expenses. He kept going. And when Skylar asked questions, Walter didn't open up. He shut her out. Because deep down, this wasn't just about providing, it was about proving something. That he was still valuable, that he was powerful, that he was finally in control. And that's the dangerous part. Not the lie he told others, but the one he told himself. It was supposed to be self-defense. Two men, a threat, a desperate situation. But the moment Walter watched Crazy 8 struggle to breathe, everything changed. The first time you kill someone, your body reacts before your brain can process it. Shaking hands, shallow breath, nausea, panic. That was Walter, staring at what he'd done, heart racing, unable to look away. But what followed is even more revealing. Instead of running, Walter tried to justify it. He cleaned the mess. He buried the evidence. And most of all, he convinced himself he had no choice. But was that true? Crazy 8 was tied up, powerless, and Walter sat across from him, feeding him sandwiches, debating whether or not to let him live. It wasn't just a practical decision. It became a psychological ritual, a battle between the man Walter had always been and the version of himself he was becoming. And in the end, Walter snapped the lock, not in a moment of rage, but in cold silence. Psychologically, this is the moment when the moral compass begins to bend. when survival becomes an excuse, when the line between right and wrong doesn't break, it warps slowly, quietly, until you're not even sure where it used to be. Walter crossed a threshold that day, not because he had to, but because part of him realized he could. It started with a hat, not a plan, not a confession, not even a choice really, just a black pork pie hat low over the eyes like a mask. But something shifted the moment Walter put it on. That hat wasn't just for disguise, it was for distance. A line between two selves, Walter White, the dying man, and Heisenberg, the one who refused to die quietly. In psychology, this is called ego splitting. When a person creates a version of themselves to do what the real self can't. Walter couldn't threaten people, but Heisenberg could. Walter couldn't knock on a drug lord's door and say, "Stay out of my territory." But Heisenberg could, and he did. Heisenberg wasn't born with a gun in his hand. He was born the moment Walter realized how it felt to be feared. The scary thing? This new identity wasn't imposed on him. It was invited. Every time Walter put on the hat, it got easier. Easier to lie. Easier to intimidate. Easier to win. And somewhere along the way, Heisenberg stopped being a mask and started feeling like the truth. Skylar wasn't the enemy. She was the mirror. While Walter descended deeper into the world he swore was temporary, Skylar was the one voice still tethered to reality. She questioned. She pushed. She demanded truth. And in doing so, she threatened the one thing Walter couldn't let go of: control. At first, he shut her out with lies, then silence, then anger. And when none of that worked, manipulation. In psychology, when someone's false self begins to crack, they often lash out at those closest to them. Not because they're the problem, but because they see too clearly. Skylar didn't just see what Walter was doing, she saw why. And that terrified him. She was everything Walter once claimed to protect. But as Heisenberg grew, she became an obstacle, a threat to the empire he hadn't admitted he was building. Their relationship morphed from partnership to power struggle. And in that struggle, Walter's behavior exposed something raw: his need to dominate, to control the narrative, to force loyalty instead of earning it. By the time Skylar said, "I'm waiting for the cancer to come back," it wasn't out of cruelty, it was grief for the man she'd lost, and horror at the one he'd become. Walter had a partner, but more than that, he had a surrogate son. Jesse Pinkman wasn't just a former student, he was a broken kid, impulsive, lost, constantly searching for someone to believe in him. And Walter? He stepped in. He offered guidance. He offered structure. But beneath it all, what he really offered was control. Psychologically, their bond was complex. Walter saw Jesse as someone he could mold, someone who needed him. For a man who'd felt invisible and disrespected most of his life, that validation was intoxicating. He rescued Jesse, berated him, defended him, manipulated him. It was never clean, never healthy, but it was real. Jesse became the mirror Walter refused to look into: emotional, chaotic, guilty. He felt what Walter buried. He reacted to the violence with pain, while Walter responded with logic. And that contrast only pushed them deeper into dependence. Jesse needed a father. Walter needed control. Over time, Walter's protectiveness turned possessive. When Jesse strayed, Walter reeled him back. When Jesse questioned, Walter gaslighted. And when Jesse finally tried to leave, Walter punished him with precision. This wasn't mentorship. It was manipulation, dressed as love. And the more Jesse bled, the more Walter tightened his grip. Because for Heisenberg, loyalty wasn't earned. It was owned. Walter once said he was in the meth business to secure his family's future. But somewhere along the way, that story collapsed. When pressed, he didn't say, "I'm doing it for my kids." He said, "I'm in the empire business." That moment wasn't a slip. It was a confession. Psychologically, Walter had crossed into something new: narcissistic inflation. He was no longer surviving. He was building, conquering, demanding respect. And that respect became more important than money, than safety, than anything. He started justifying the unjustifiable. He poisoned a child, not out of hate, but as a tactic to manipulate Jesse. And when he stood in the doorway, watching Jane suffocate on her own breath, he didn't walk away because he didn't care. He cried, but he still let her die. Why? Because in that moment, he believed it was the only way to protect Jesse, and more importantly, to keep Jesse tied to him. It wasn't hate, it was control, wrapped in twisted logic. Walter's genius had always been his ability to solve impossible problems. But the more power he gained, the more he treated people like variables. Movable, expendable, necessary for the greater equation. And by the time he had his empire, there was nothing left of the man who once said, "I'm doing this for my family." He wasn't building safety anymore. He was building legacy, his legacy. Hank wasn't just Walter's brother-in-law. He was everything Walter wasn't: loud, confident, impulsive, and respected. And in that contrast, Walter found something dangerous: resentment. In the beginning, Hank was comic relief. He cracked jokes, belittled Walter, called him Waltu, but underneath those jabs was a dynamic Walter couldn't ignore. Hank had the power, the pride, the identity. Walter had silence. So when Walter became Heisenberg, part of him wasn't just hiding from Hank. He was outgrowing him. Psychologically, Hank was the embodiment of everything Walter wanted the world to see in him: strength, authority, recognition. And as Walter's empire grew, so did his quiet pleasure in watching Hank stay two steps behind. It wasn't just evasion, it was performance. But when Hank finally discovered the truth, something broke. In that garage, when he whispered, "I don't even know who you are," Walter didn't deny it. He leaned in and said, "If that's true, maybe your best course would be to tread lightly." It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. That moment wasn't about meth or family. It was about dominance. And from that point on, Walter stopped running. He started playing. Even as Hank closed in, Walter held on to the belief that he was smarter, tougher, better. But in the end, he wasn't. And when Hank lay dying in the desert, begging for dignity, Walter, this time, couldn't save him. Because Heisenberg was never Hank's enemy. He was his reflection, twisted in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, this was the universe where the Joker didn't need a mask, where he didn't bring chaos to prove a point. He brought chemistry, and he won. Empires don't collapse in one moment. They rot slowly until everything comes crashing down at once. For Walter, that moment was Ozymandias. The title itself, a warning, a poem about a king who built something magnificent, only for it to vanish into dust. In this chapter of his story, Walter lost everything: his money, his power, his family, and, finally, his myth. Hank was dead. Skylar turned on him. Flynn screamed that he wanted nothing to do with him. Even the baby recoiled. For the first time, Walter wasn't feared or obeyed. He was alone and pathetic. What we're watching here, psychologically, is the collapse of a grand delusion. Walter had believed, truly believed, that he could control it all, that he was always the smartest man in the room, that every loss was just a necessary step in the greater plan. But in Ozymandias, he had to face the truth. There was no plan, only wreckage. He made one last desperate gesture, calling Skylar and pretending to threaten her so she wouldn't be held responsible. But even that act of protection was twisted, because Walter never stopped trying to rewrite his story. Even at rock bottom, he wanted control of the narrative. And what's most haunting, he still believed deep down that maybe, just maybe, he could still fix it. By the end, there was nothing left to hide behind. No family, no empire, no lies that held up under pressure. So when Walter sat across from Skylar for the last time, she asked the question she'd asked for years. "If you say one more time that you did this for the family?" And he didn't. He looked her in the eyes and said the truth. "I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive." That moment matters more than any shootout, any escape, any chemical formula. Because it's the moment Walter White finally became honest, with Skylar and with himself. Psychologically, this was the end of the ego splitting. No more masks, no more Heisenberg, just a man owning his choices, for better or worse. But even in confession, there's ego. He still wanted to be remembered for his brilliance. He still wanted meaning in the mess. And maybe that's what makes Walter so human. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who made the wrong choices for reasons that felt right, until they didn't. And in the end, all that was left was the truth. Walter White's story didn't begin with greed or violence. It began with fear, with a man who felt small his entire life, finally realizing he had power and mistaking that power for purpose. What makes his descent so haunting isn't how far he falls. It's how slowly it happens, how every step felt justified, how every lie sounded like love, how Heisenberg wasn't created in one moment. He was revealed, one decision at a time. And maybe that's what makes Walter so unforgettable. He didn't break bad. He peeled away everything that had been holding him back. In the end, he wasn't a victim. He wasn't even a villain. He was the man who knocked and opened the door to what he really was. And maybe what scared us most is how much of him we recognized in ourselves.